Well, hello and welcome to Sunday morning coffee with Dr. Childress here. I have my coffee with me this morning. And today I want to talk about the pathology in the family courts related to spousal abuse. Um, in my view, this pathology is primarily a spousal abuse pathology using the child as a weapon and then creating the weapon of the child in weaponizing the child into the spousal conflict. The pathological parent creates such significant pathology in the child that it rises to the level of child psychological abuse. But the primary driving motivation is spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. And mental health professionals have duty to protect obligations, and that's to everybody. So we actually have duty to protect the targeted parent as well as the child in this family conflict in the family courts. And the mental health professionals are massively failing in that obligation to protect the parent. So I want to talk about the spousal abuse in the family courts today. The um, the pathology itself, shared persecutory delusion and a factitious pathology, is a pathology of lies. And one of the primary lies is it says this isn't about you as the parent, it's about the child. No, that's a lie. This is entirely about you. It is spousal, emotional, and psychological abuse of you using the child as the weapon. So that's the one of the first manipulations that occurs in the family courts to disempower the targeted parent from being able to defend themselves against the spousal abuse using the child as a weapon, because they say, "Wow, I'm being heard that I'm being abused emotionally and psychologically by the other spouse who's creating pathology in the child." But if they make that statement that they're in pain and suffering, the answer they get from the mental health people is this isn't about you, it's about the child. No, it is about you. It's spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. Then it's also becomes child abuse, child psychological abuse when the allied pathological parent creates such significant pathology in the child as the weapon of the abuse. So that's the first issue that needs to be addressed is the tremendous amount of lies and manipulation, Machiavellian levels of manipulation. If you want to know what Machiavellian manipulation is, it's that this level of lies that it's not about you, it's about the child, and then that disempowers the targeted parent from being able to protect themselves. So, the second associated lie that goes along with that has to do with the child's best interests. And they say, well, it's not about you, it's about the child. We're looking at the child's best interests. Well, it's always in the child's best interest to restore a healthy and normal range attachment bond to both parents. That's simple. Okay, so that's been dealt with right there. Boom. It's always in the child's best interest to restore a normal range and healthy attachment bond to both parents. So let's do that. Okay, now we need a diagnosis as to why is the child rejecting the parent. We need a treatment plan to fix it. The second lie is this is somehow about custody. No, it's not. Custody is a symptom of the pathology. It's another variant of the spousal abuse. They're driving it into the courts, the pathological parent is, to make it as hard as possible for this parent to see their children, the targeted parent, by putting up barriers, time barriers. The courts go so slow. They toss out allegations of abuse. They get separations and supervised visitation, even sometimes for the targeted parent because as people are investigating the false allegations of abuse, so and it's financially extremely expensive to drive it into the court. So that's a version of financial spousal abuse, trying to take away and sap them of their financial resources that they can fight back. So driving it into the court system is a symptom of the pathology. It's not about custody. Custody is easy to solve, 50-50 or every other weekend variance. That's easy to solve. The problem is the child's attachment pathology. The child's rejecting a parent, and then everybody gets worried about abuse range parenting. That's the problem. It's a healthcare problem. It's a diagnosis problem. It's a treatment problem. And so we need to get it back into the healthcare system because it's always in the child's best interest to restore healthy attachment bonds to both parents. So this is just a pathology of lies from the get-go. But to anchor us in actual professional practice, there are three dangerous pathologies in mental health: suicide, homicide, and abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse, and elder abuse. Now, whenever any mental health professional encounters any of those three dangerous pathologies, suicide, homicide, abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse, or elder abuse, we have duty to protect obligations that become active whenever we encounter any of the dangerous pathologies, such as suicide. The patient says they're kind of thinking about hurting themselves or suicidal. We have obligations to either conduct a proper risk assessment ourselves or to ensure that one gets conducted. So we get them over to the emergency room to get an evaluation of their suicidality. Same thing for homicide. We have duty to warn. We have various obligations to assess for possible dangerousness. And then for abuse, physical, sexual, and physical, sexual, and neglect abuse are mandated reports into CPS for investigation to protect the forensic evidence. Psychological abuse, we're allowed to investigate more fully, and spousal abuse, elder abuse, we're allowed to investigate um, more fully. But we have to do something around all dangerous pathology because we have a duty to protect, a legally obligating duty. Now, in the family courts, that we have two dangerous pathologies: child abuse and spousal abuse, that are of critical concern. And both of those need a proper risk assessment. So we are in the world of dangerous pathologies in the family courts. And that's one of the major disservices that forensic psychology has done in the family courts is they haven't anchored us into the proper diagnostic realm. And the proper diagnostic realm is a dangerous pathology. We have allegations from both parents related to possible child or possible abuse allegations. So, from the allied parent, we have allegations of child abuse in some way by the targeted parent. Often it's pretty vague, but there's allegations, false allegations sometimes of physical, sexual, or neglect abuse, or emotional, psychological abuse that need a proper risk assessment. If anybody's concerned about child abuse for any reason, we get a proper risk assessment. And then there's allegations of a history of domestic violence or spousal abuse. Now, the actual clinical term for that domain is called intimate partner violence, and I recommend everybody start shifting over to that terminology and that way of thinking about domestic violence and spousal abuse as intimate partner violence so that we can get anchored in the research literature. But then the targeted parent is making allegations that it's child psychological abuse by the allied parent, a shared persecutory delusion and factitious attachment pathology being imposed on the child. So now we have allegations of abuse by both parents. And so we need to get a proper risk assessment for child abuse, and forensic psychology has not been doing that and has not been alerting the court as to the proper diagnostic realm that we're in. We also have allegations from the targeted parent that they may not be making directly, but the mental health people should recognize it, and I will make it on behalf of the targeted parent, that it's spousal psychological abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child as the weapon. So, part of the pathology right now is to isolate its victim. the targeted parent from rescue or help related to the spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. And the mental health professionals are failing in their duty to protect obligations or misdiagnosing the dangerousness of the pathology involved, and they're failing in their duty to protect the targeted parent from spousal abuse. So I will make that position for them 100% of the time, that in these cases, we are potentially looking at spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. So that requires a proper risk assessment for the possible shared persecutory delusion and factitious attachment pathology. Now, it's what's interesting about the factitious disorder imposed on another, a false attachment pathology being imposed on the child, is that all the rest of mental health deals with diagnosing a real pathology: ADHD, autism, eating disorders, substance abuse, depression, anxiety. There's an actual disorder that we're trying to figure out its cause. A factitious disorder is the only pathology where we're diagnosing the absence of a pathology. That there's symptoms there, but there's no underlying pathology. It's an artificial, false created pathology. And so that's requires some degree of understanding and professional expertise from the mental health professional related to both what the real pathologies it's mimicking are, so attachment system and family systems kind of conflict. So we have to understand what it's mimicking as well as how it's false. So there we have the persecutory delusion, the false attachment pathology. It's not an authentic attachment system display. And so we make the diagnosis around the factitious disorder. It's a false attachment pathology being imposed on the child. And so that's kind of an interesting diagnostic feature relative to the mental health professionals that they need to step up on, related to the child psychological abuse. In addition, I will just note in passing that the allied parent and child allegations are often vague, that there's just some generalized concern about something, some emotional abuse kind of, or physical abuse kind of, or it's very non-specific. And the allegations of spousal abuse will be the same. They're sort of, now all parents, okay, if you're going through a divorce, all people, it's likely there's going to be conflict and hostility between the spouses as they're going through the divorce. There's likely to be arguments and fights, and there might be bad things said to one another. The husband may call his wife a stupid person, and the wife may call her husband an evil man. But that's within the scope of normal range divorces, okay, the angry. And so we have to anchor ourselves to a degree within understanding on the spousal abuse issues, and understanding that of course there's been words shared and angry things and exchanged as part of the divorce process. We'd want to look for terrorist IPV, what happened before the divorce process, as well as what's happened since the divorce process. But divorces are going to involve angry. That's just kind of the way they are. And so you get these vague allegations of domestic violence or spousal abuse. But this is about the child's relationship to the targeted parent. This isn't a spousal conflict. And so they're getting kind of mixed up on that. Whereas the targeted parent, it's very specific. We're looking at for shared persecutory delusion, and factitious attachment pathology, and we're looking for using the child cross-generational coalition, using the child as a weapon of spousal psychological abuse. So the allegations from the targeted parent are that there's child psychological abuse, creating a shared induced persecutory delusion and false factitious attachment pathology in the child for secondary gain to the allied parent. And there's allegations of spousal or partner abuse psychological. These are both in the DSM. There's your diagnostic numbers for them. And that's the emotional and psychological abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child's induced pathology as the weapon. So that's a very specific allegation from the targeted parent. Now, the targeted parent may not be voicing that specifically. They may be coming in talking about words like parental alienation, which would be the child's psychological abuse, but also it would activate concerns around using the child as a weapon. It is up to the mental health people who work in the family courts to translate the layperson symptom reporting of the general public, because they're just getting a divorce. They're not all up to speed on the pathology of the other party, the allied parent, or the nature of the pathology of a factitious disorder, shared delusional. They're not up to speed on that. They're just a normal human getting a divorce. And so, but it's up to the mental health people. That's our obligation to bring the professional level of knowledge and to recognize that we have two dangerous pathologies potentially present from both parties. Both parties are making allegations of two dangers: child abuse, each one saying the other one's somehow abusing the child, and spousal abuse. Each one is saying the other one is somehow emotionally or psychologically abusive of, of the other spouse and parent. So both halves of that differential diagnosis have to be properly assessed. The reason why I put the word proper in there all the time, a proper risk assessment, because that's the links to the negligence, Google negligence, failure to take or show proper care in doing something. So if they fail to take proper care in conducting their risk assessment or their assessment for dangerous pathology, then that would be a negligent and misdiagnosis, or if they did indeed misdiagnose the pathology in the family courts. So we have two allegations of danger by the targeted parent. Um, the allegations by the allied parent are either, so the allied parent makes allegations of child abuse either by innuendo or directly. And they can be true allegations. That's the first thing. There could be child abuse, range parenting by the targeted parent that needs the proper assessment, or they could be false allegations, in which case the differential diagnosis of a persecutory delusion and false attachment pathology become relevant. Oftentimes they are vague allegations, and that's we need to get more specificity as we do the diagnostic assessment as to what the specific allegations are, because we're making a differential between true child abuse or spousal abuse concerns or child abuse concerns and false or factitious concerns out of a persecutory delusion, and dark personality, manipulative kinds of stuff. So we need to get really specific on what these allegations are. And that's a part of the specialized expertise that's needed for the family courts, is the ability to do that. Then we have allegations by the allied parent, oftentimes, of domestic violence. And that's typically how they frame it. We need to, as professionals, we need to move that domestic violence, generalized, vague term, over into actual research grounded kinds of knowledge, which is intimate partner violence. And in intimate partner violence research, there's two types of IPV. One is situational, one is called terrorist. And the one we're worried about is the terrorist IPV. That's the narcissistic, typically narcissistic man, narcissistic husband, father. And there's, as the name implies, terrorist, there's a lot of control, violence, intimidation kinds of features to that. The one we're less concerned about, relative to custody decisions after divorce, is situational IPV. That's where, as they're getting a divorce, something happens, they get angry and things get out of hand. Okay. And there's a dispute. Maybe the police were called and things got out of hand. But it was an isolated incident. It's called situational. It was unfortunate. It shouldn't have happened, but it's not a long term concern, especially when we get the two people separated from each other. Neither one, or at least the perpetrator in this, is not a danger. Oftentimes we see them getting married again or develop another relationship, and it's fine in that relationship. They're not a domestic abuser in that situation. There's no IPV in that second marriage. It was just a situational event that arose earlier. And so that's the important when we get these allegations of domestic violence from the allied parent. It's important to anchor it in intimate partner violence and begin to do the assessment as to whether it's terrorist IPV or situational IPV. The other feature about allegations of domestic violence from the allied parent is that if it's not a terrorist situation that's of concern, that we have duty to protect obligations to the allied parent, then it is a symptom that it's kind of irrelevant. The spousal issue and the spousal relationship is independent and irrelevant to the parent-child relationship. And the domestic violence monkeys, DV monkeys, will try to bring in the research, on the bad effects of domestic violence on children. Yes, I'm familiar with that research. I come out of child abuse. Yes, I know the association of domestic violence to child abuse, but post-divorce, and in this current situation with the differentials involved, we're looking at what is the parent-child relationship with the target parent and the child. We will note concerns about spousal abuse in the past, but that's not a decisional criteria in this situation unless we got the terrorist IPV. And so if that's a concern, let's do an assessment. Let's see if there's a terrorist IPV kind of person here, where we're concerned about everybody's safety in that situation. The so the all allegations, all allegations should receive a proper risk assessment. Uh, that the screening for dangerous pathology is, are you concerned about anything? Okay, the screening for suicide, are you concerned about harming yourself? Yes. Well, then we do a proper assessment. The screen for homicide, are you thinking about hurting somebody else? Yes. Well, then we do a proper screening for dangerous homicide, dangerous. And is there any concern about child abuse? Is there any concern about spousal abuse? Yes. All right, then we do a proper risk assessment for those. So if anybody has concern, it's a very low threshold, then we should do a proper risk assessment for the concern involved. And we have the allied parent who has concerns about child abuse in some way or in history, oftentimes of spousal abuse. And we definitely have the targeted parent who is alleging that there's child psychological abuse, the shared persecutory delusion, and the targeted parent is alleging spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. So those duty to protect are active 100% of the time, just out of the targeted parent's side. And we can assess the allied parent too, because that's what their initial claim is. The child's rejecting the parent because there's some sort of abusive range parenting by the targeted parent. So we're in abuse. That's the pathology that we're working with: dangerousness and abuse. And the forensic psychologists have been improperly orienting and informing the court as to the nature of the pathology in the family. So we have, the two parties, both are making allegations. The allegations by the targeted parent are for a DSM diagnosis of child psychological abuse, creating a shared induced persecutory delusion, the false factitious attachment pathology in the child for secondary gain to the allied parent. And the targeted parent is alleging that there's emotional and psychological abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child's induced pathology as the weapon. So, just simply by that, we have two parties in the litigation, we have two people involved. The mental health people are required by standards of professional practice, duty to protect obligations to conduct a proper risk assessment for the concerns of the targeted parent. However, they have not been doing that. They have just simply been disregarding the concerns of the targeted parent, not been conducting a proper risk assessment, and as a result, have been misdiagnosing both of these. Okay, so they have missed the diagnosis. That's what misdiagnosis is. You missed it. And so they didn't identify the pathology. They didn't identify it for the court. They didn't identify it for treatment. Identify means the same thing as diagnose. And so they missed the diagnosis. They missed, and what is it? A negligent misdiagnosis. Did they fail to take proper care in conducting the assessment for this, for the concerns of the targeted parent? And did they conduct a proper assessment for the allied parent? Yeah, well, that's a separate consideration. What I'm talking about today is, did they conduct the proper risk assessment for the concerns raised by the targeted parent? And no, they did not, consistently, routinely. And as a result, these parents, the spouses, are being subjected to a brutal and savage spousal abuse, emotional and psychological abuse of this targeted parent, using the kid as a weapon. That parent, at normal range, targeted parent, used to have a child before the divorce. They were a mom, they were a dad. That's part of their identity, mom, dad, and they're raising a kid. And that's been their dream since childhood, is to be a mom and dad themselves and to have a family. It was all going along, they thought, relatively well. Then they get a divorce. The spouse, they chose a bad spouse. They don't get along. So then they wind up getting a divorce. Now, after the divorce, that person, that parent, no longer has a child. The child is rejecting them. They don't see them. They don't have Christmas with them. They don't see them ever. And the child says, I never want to see you. They've lost their child. And that's role of mom and dad. They're no longer mom and dad. What happened? It's like somebody came and killed their child after the divorce. Yes, they did. The allied parent psychologically killed the other parent's child in retaliation for the divorce. That is awful thing to do. That's the most brutal thing possible. You're so angry about the divorce and the spousal conflict, you kill the other person's child, and then they get the child to be the murderer. You know what that's doing to the child's psychological makeup, to have to kill their own parent in the loyalty to the other parent. Oh my God, this is awful spousal abuse. And yet no one's diagnosing it. It's just phenomenal to me that the spousal abuse component of this is being absolutely misdiagnosed and mistreated. And holy cow, the mental health people in the family courts are really, really bad. So, all mental health professionals, all mental health professionals have duty to protect obligations. And we have duty to protect obligations for everyone. That's the child and the parents, all people. We have duty to protect obligations. So we have duty to protect obligations relative to the targeted parent. And they may act tough or strong, or, especially some of the dads, may not raise the issue of spousal abuse because they're a dad, and, the women aren't supposed to abuse men and men are supposed to be the abusers. Not in the family courts. No, no, no. That the borderline spectrum mom, the dark personality moms, will kill the child relative to the father as revenge and retaliation. Aren't you sorry for leaving me now? For not being a better spouse and for not pleasing me? Aren't you sorry now for that? So most definitely, we have the emotional and psychological abuse of the men, the fathers in the family courts, And the mental health people are just whiffing on that entirely. And it's more obvious when we get the narcissistic dad in the family courts who's using the children as weapons against a normal range mom. Then it can become the spousal abuse component can become more overt when you have the narcissistic dad. Oftentimes, the concern is with the father-son relationship. He turns his son into a weapon. That can get particularly dangerous. You might have the mom calling police just for her own safety, and then the child uses that against the mom. How dare you call the police on me? But he was threatening mom. Sometimes you'll see the daughters rise into that level of abuse of their mother relative to the father. When you have a father daughter alliance against the mother, that's the incest pattern, the special relationship of a father and daughter against that excludes the mother. I'm not worried in this generational iteration that it's actual physical incest, it's psychological as it's moving through the generations. But that's the psychological pattern when you have a father daughter against them that against the mother that excludes the mother from the relationship. When you have the father son against the mother, then my concerns for high levels of violence, domestic violence, kinds of features come into play. But there's the spousal abuse is true for both men and women in the family courts, and it needs a proper assessment because it is brutal to lose your child. You no longer have a child, and that role of being a mom or a dad, that's fundamental to who we are, and that's ripped from these people, their life meaning and their life goals and their life dreams and everything. We're just being ripped from them. That's brutal spousal abuse. And they say, well, you deserve it because you abused the child in some way. First off, no one deserves cruelty. That's the spousal abuse idea that it's okay to be cruel to people if they deserve it. Yeah, of course I hit her. My dinner was cold. She deserved it. And that's the same mentality we have here. Yes, it's okay to be cruel to the targeted parent because they deserve it somehow. That's a spousal abuse theme. And these mental health people, these forensic psychologists, are so incredibly ignorant that they don't even recognize the spousal abuse theme of, yeah, of course I hit her. She deserved it. Yeah, of course he deserves to lose his child because he was abusive in some way. If there's authentic abuse, let's diagnose this and fix it. And then restore the child's healthy attachment bond to the formerly abusive parent. If there's not authentic abuse, then we're looking at a false pathology, a factitious abuse pathology, a factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child for secondary gain to the dark triad, dark tetrad, narcissistic borderline parent of manipulating the court's decisions on child custody and to meet their own emotional and psychological needs. So if it's not authentic abuse, then we're automatically over into the other uh, differential diagnosis. So all mental health professionals have duty to protect obligations for everybody involved, and all concerns around any dangerous pathology, suicide, homicide, or abuse require a proper risk assessment to the danger of concern. And the level of concern is extremely low. Does somebody have a concern? Raise your hand. Somebody have concern about abuse, spousal abuse, suicide, dangerous homicide, any concerns? Yes. Let's get a proper risk assessment to that concern. Simple as that. And in this family courts, both parties are making allegations. So all allegations should receive a proper risk assessment to the differential diagnosis of concern for each parent. Simple. So the moment this hits the family courts, where you have custody conflicts surrounding a child displaying attachment pathology towards a parent, child's rejecting a parent for any reason, some reason, I don't care what the reason is. Let's get it out to get a proper risk assessment for differential diagnosis of concern relative to who's worried about what. There are two litigants in the situation. Both litigants deserve to have their concerns properly addressed. Courts do not diagnose pathology. They're not authorized by the state. Judges don't have a license to diagnose and treat pathology. Doctors do, psychologists do. So get it over to the doctors to diagnose, identify what the pathology is, the problem is, and to put it on an effective treatment plan to fix it. Now, no treatment plan for child abuse will be effective if I'm sending the child home to be abused by the abusive parent. So if I've got physical abuse, mom's beating the kid with an electrical cord, if I send that kid home to be beaten with electrical cords every day, my therapy is not going to be effective for the physical abuse. The first thing we do with all child abuse diagnosis, all of them, is we protect the child. We separate the child from the abusive parent. Then we recover the normal range and healthy development of the child. Then we restore with the contact with the abusive parent with enough safeguards in place to make sure the abuse doesn't resume. That's what we do with all forms of child abuse. That's what we need to be doing with this form of child abuse. We need to accurately diagnose it 100% of the time. And we can do that once we set our goal to do that. And then once we get the accurate diagnosis, we develop a treatment plan for that diagnosis and we can fix it. What's happening currently is we're not getting the diagnosis of child abuse, we're not getting the protective separation or the appropriate treatment plan. And as a result, no therapy in the family courts has ever fixed this pathology. And they're going, oh, it's so complicated and it's so different. No, it's not. It's actually pretty simple if you just apply the established knowledge of clinical psychology. If you're just a doctor, you got differential diagnoses, you apply knowledge, attachment, family systems, DSM-5, complex trauma, psychological control. You can apply knowledge to solve pathology. But if you just come in with your ignorance and start making stuff up, and you don't diagnose, you don't identify what the problem is, you just start to go in and try to fix stuff without understanding what you're trying to fix, then that's negligent misdiagnosis and negligent treatment. And you're not even in the realm of being a healthcare professional. You're just like your plumber or architect or whoever who's just coming in and making decisions based on your personal opinion. No, that's extraordinarily problematic. So in the legal system, though, the legal system has two parties. And so it should be pretty straightforward to get the assessment for both parties' areas of concern. Up on my website, I have diagnostic questions to be answered by a mental health assessment. That's all. That's all cases of this. So that's what the answers that the court should be expecting from the mental health people. So the mental health people need to step it up considerably because they're not even getting close to giving the court the necessary information the court needs. And so that's a scandal, absolute scandal within professional psychology that they're trying to cover up. There's specific people in positions of power and influence who are disabling the mental health system response because if the moment we solve this, their forensic custody evaluations go away. And that's the only thing they've ever done in their life. So they don't want those to stop. Or their construct of parental alienation goes away and they're no longer experts in parental. So they don't want that to go away. They want everything to stay exactly the way things are because they're flourishing in this ecosystem of damaged systems. They're making their money just fine. If everything gets solved, they're not making money anymore because you need to know what the treatment is and they don't, and they need to be able to make the diagnosis and they can't. So we get professionals in who can make the diagnosis, do make the diagnosis for child abuse, and then treat it successfully. And now all the incompetent people no longer have their cushy positions in the family courts. So they're failing in their duty to protect obligations to the child and to the parent and to the court. The court we have obligations when these situations are involved. Let me talk about that for a second. As a mental health professional, this could be the child's only encounter with the mental health system, and we got a child abuse diagnosis, and we have the court's decisions on child custody are going to have a monumental impact on the child. This we could be siding with the child abuser and giving the child to the abusive parent if we misdiagnose the pathology, or we could be, and that'll destroy the child's life, or we could make an accurate diagnosis of where the child abuse is and protect the child, which will give the child a normal and healthy range of life. So, based on the court's decision, the child's life is going to go in massively different directions. And so, the mental health information that is being provided to the court needs to be accurate 100% of the time, and it needs to be information that the court can rely on for its decisions. And so the mental health people need to step up to the plate here big time. And if that's too much responsibility and you don't want to make the diagnosis, or you feel like you can't make the diagnosis then get out of the family courts. Go work something else, because you're working in the family courts, you're working child abuse and complex trauma. And if you mess up with a factitious disorder, you're going to be sending the kid to an abusive parent and destroying the child's life. So don't mess up. You don't have that option if you're going to be over here. And I suggest that there's ways to do that. The mental health people need to develop a stronger community of consultation, and they need to all be relying on the same knowledge applied to the situation to reach professional level decisions about the child that we communicate to the court, and protect the child and give that child a healthy life every single time. That's our job as doctors, to cure cancer 100% of the time. We don't want to lose a child to cancer. No, that's just not an option. So, the allegations by the targeted parent that need a proper assessment is that there's child psychological abuse, shared persecutory delusion, factitious disorder imposed on the child for secondary gain to the allied parent, and there's emotional and psychological abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child's induced pathology as the weapon. The idea that the mental health people can have such a complete failure of empathy for the targeted parent speaks to the cruelty of these mental health people, that absence of empathy and the cruelty they're inflicting on the targeted parent. Now, I've been in the family courts for 10 years treating the trauma, the traumatic grief created in the targeted parent by the forensic psychologist. So I want everybody to be clear on that. I'm a clinical psychologist in the family courts treating the trauma created by the forensic psychologists for their failure in their duty to protect, and oftentimes, most oftentimes, colluding and participating in the emotional and psychological abuse of the targeted parent. The mental health people are spousal abusers. That's just awful, 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 awful. Not only are they spousal abusers, they're child abusers. That's awful, 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 awful. So, the mental health system, that we need outside and independent review of forensic psychology. The mental health system needs to get in here. APA, American Psychological Association, they need to start getting the court system the competence that the court system and that these children and that these parents deserve. What we have in the family courts is active spousal abuse, using the child as a weapon, and active child abuse, creating the shared persecutory delusion. We likely have some cases of authentic dangerousness with the targeted parent that needs to be accurately diagnosed 100% of the time. So, with that, I'm going to wrap up my discussion of the spousal abuse, using the kids as a weapon in this situation. The I recently reviewed this screening assessment protocol out of Australia called DOORS, and there's just a thought disorder in the family courts. The screening for any dangerous pathology is anybody concerned about, suicide, homicide, or abuse of any form? Raise your hand. Somebody raises their hand, then that's the screening. You don't need a major screening on this. We assess for the appropriate differential diagnosis all the time. And the spousal abuse of the targeted parent using the child as a weapon is the most brutal and savage emotional and psychological abuse of a spouse, of a human being I have ever come across. So I've worked child abuse, I've worked medical issues like spina bifida and cancer in kids and stuff. I've worked foster care. Uh, this abuse, psychological, emotional abuse of the targeted parents using the child as a weapon, is savage. It's just phenomenal, and that they're not getting any protection from the mental health people. The mental health people aren't even recognizing it. They go, it's not about you; it's about the child. What's the best interest of the child? They're just part of the pathology, and so it's a nightmare in the family courts. So with that, good luck to everybody out there in getting the competence you and your children deserve and that the court deserves. And until we get the motivation out of the mental health people to actually protect children from child abuse and the spouses from spousal abuse, it's going to be a nightmare in the family courts for situations. I'm doing what I can, telling people, trying to stop things, trying to get people on the path of treatment rather than the broken path of and false path of custody. Everything about this pathology is a lie. Everything about this pathology is a lie, starting with the premises. So with that, good luck to everybody out there and happy Sunday. Bye-bye.